All right, let's take a look at section 3. Here's the focus question. The effective nullification of Reconstruction era laws and amendments and the making of blacks into second class citizens reflected trends across the nation. America seemed to be fracturing along racial and class lines in the late 19th century. One observer noted that the result was a far reaching obsession with redrawing the boundary of freedom by identifying and excluding those unworthy of freedom's blessings. Many Americans seem to adopt a more exclusive definition of nationhood and national identity. The 1890s witnessed a major shift in the sources of immigration to the U.S. Despite the prolonged depression, 3.5 million newcomers entered the United States during the decade, seeking jobs in the industrial centers of the North and Midwest. Over half arrived not from the traditional sources of immigration, but from Southern and Eastern Europe, especially Italy and the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires. The new immigrants were widely described by native-born Americans as members of distinct races, whose lower level of civilization explained everything from their willingness to work for substandard wages to their supposed inborn tendency towards criminal behavior. The new immigration helped to trigger a resurgence of racial nationalism in the United States and elsewhere in the world. Exclusion was central to efforts to build political communities, especially as older sources of unity splintered with the advent of industrialization and globalization. Many Americans who felt aggrieved because of economic changes sought to recreate a sense of belonging, juxtaposing our identity against people deemed other because of color, religion, political view, or some other characteristic. Restricting immigration was widely seen as a way to determine who was fit to be an American and thus to upgrade the quality of the population. Founded in 1894 by a group of Boston professionals, the Immigration Restriction League spread rapidly across the country. It made a sharp distinction between old and new immigrants and blamed the latter for problems ranging from urban crime and poverty to mass unemployment. The League insisted that newcomers from Southern and Eastern Europe were incapable of taking part intelligently in democratic politics and called for reducing immigration by barring the illiterate from entering the United States. A law of 1903 did bar a long list of persons from entering the United States, among them anarchists, the first time those holding a specific political viewpoint were denied the right to immigrate. And with the enactment of measures to exclude the Chinese, the United States pioneered the development of a racialized immigration policy. Northern and Western states, like those in the South, experimented with ways to eliminate undesirable voters. Nearly all the states during the 1890s adopted the secret or Australian ballot, meant both to protect voters' privacy and to limit the participation of illiterates who could no longer receive help from party officials at polling places. Several states ended the practice of allowing immigrants to vote before becoming citizens and adopted stringent new residency and literacy requirements. None of these measures approached the scope of black disenfranchisement in the South or the continued denial of voting rights to women in nearly all the states. But throughout the country, suffrage was increasingly becoming a privilege, not a right. Although single Chinese men had been welcomed as cheap contract labor in the West, when Chinese families started to migrate in the 1870s, Congress barred women from migrating in 1875. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which temporarily excluded all Chinese immigrants from entering the country. This was the first time that race had been used to exclude an entire group of people from entering the United States, and it was made permanent in 1902. At the time of exclusion, more than 100,000 people of Chinese descent lived in America, mostly on the West Coast, and they suffered intense discrimination and occasional mob violence. States like California discriminated against the Chinese in education and other areas. Through the legal challenges and lawsuits brought by four various courts, Chinese immigrants helped define the reach of the 14th Amendment. While the Supreme Court upheld the citizenship of children born to Chinese immigrants on American soil, the court also affirmed the right of Congress to erect racial restrictions on immigration. Chinese exclusion long affected Chinese immigrants who were perceived to be incapable of assimilation. Changes in the women's movement reflected the same expansion of activity and narrowing boundaries. The 1890s began what would be called the Women's Era, 3 decades in which women, though still denied the vote, had greater opportunities for economic independence and a role in public life. Nearly 5 million women worked for wages by 1900, and though most were young, unmarried, and worked in traditional women's jobs such as domestic service and garments, a new generation of college-educated women were taking better paid white-collar jobs. Women also had more influence in politics and society through a number of new organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, founded in 1874, which moved from demanding prohibition laws to demanding comprehensive economic and political reform, including the vote. Yet, feminism in this period moved away from demanding equal rights to claims more in line with dominant racial and ethnic norms. While feminism of equal rights was never fully repudiated, the mostly native born white and middle class women who dominated the suffrage movement laid claim to the vote as members of a superior race and complained that unworthy non whites, such as immigrants, had the vote while white women did not. So that was section 3. We'll be back with section 4.